Hey, so here we are. We've been working on snowman scenes for a while. There's a recap on the screen. You can pause the video if you need to review what you should have done so far. We're picking up here with day 3 and how to add a camera, set up a backdrop, and a base. I looked at my old videos, I didn't like them, so I'm going to redo that for you. So in this scene here, I happen to have a meadow background. It's a little bit difficult to tell perspective. What I'm going to do is change back to a 4 view, and if I look from the left viewport here, I'm going to click on my snow person and zoom in on the selection. You can see that between this point here and this point here, there's a thin blue line that represents the meadow. It's a plane, which means it's a 2-dimensional object. I will recreate that. I also want to show it to you from a perspective viewport, which I can tumble around. And this one doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I'm going to make this one the top viewport, so you can just kind of like get an idea from the top what it looks like. I could just touch T on the keyboard if I wanted to, but if I scroll back far enough, you'll see that top-down view, there's a plane, perspective, orthographic. This is almost a front view. So what I'm going to do is delete it just to recreate the process of creating it. Our snow person looks pretty small here when you look at a giant meadow around him. Let's take a look at him more or less from the front. There's our snow person. Snow person's got modifiers on the arms as well as on the spheres. Things have been named so that we can tell what they are. And what we're going to do is we're going to introduce creating a new piece of geometry known as a plane. So up here in the creation panel, which is part of the plus sign, and then in the geometric primitives or standard primitives, you'll find plane as an object that you could use. So by clicking on plane, it's got a color here by default that I could change if I wanted to, but blue will be just fine. That's what I used earlier. I'm going to make it a slightly lighter shade of blue, a little more icy. And I can click to create, and as I create my initial size, I'm just holding the mouse button down, and when I let go of it, I've created a rectangle in effect. It has snapped to the grid, so when you look from the front, it's not noticeable. When you look from the top, it's noticeable, and same in this perspective viewport over here. So this particular sizes for our application come from a sample video that we've been watching, and I want to point out 2 things. One is the initial position, which is at the bottom of the screen here. I'm not going to override it, but some people have been confused and they've put different values in the position here for X, Y, and Z. And there is an X, Y, and Z listed here, which is the location of the selection. But what we're talking about for X, Y, and Z oftentimes are settings that we do up in the modify panel here. And that will come into play in a minute when we do a modifier. So I'm not concerned with the location, but I do want to make sure that the length is set to 5,000 units as well as the width. And this is in centimeters in our world. And so it's quite large. In fact, if we take a look proportionally, we've got a snow person in the middle of a very large field. It's rather excessive, but in this straightforward approach, we're not going to worry about cutting down on that at all. So there's nothing of interest about this plane. It's perfectly flat. And if you look here in the left viewport, you can see there's nothing of interest about it. I do want to make sure you've got length segments and width segments of 128. That's important as well. So rather than leave it at plane 001, I'm going to call it Meadow. So that I've changed the name, and if I wanted to, I could change the color simply by clicking on the color swatch. Some of you have asked about that. So here's my Meadow, and we'll change the color later. That's not the focus of this, but just to give it some contrast. We're going to add a modifier. And adding a modifier is done by using not the addition or creation module, but the one that, it's a bent line within a box, the modify panel. And we use this on our spheres as well. When we click on the word modifier list, we can type in the word noise, or at least touch N, and it brings up the noise modifier. Now it's essential that you do have some segmentation on your plane. If you try to add noise to a plane without segments, last time I tried, it crashed. And that's not a good thing. You only need to change this value called Z or Z. We're only going to change the blue arrow, which goes up, to a value of 20. And as we've found through experimentation, sometimes you need to drop back your scaling to play with that. Now we're starting to see some tessellation here. If I move this value down, you'll see that we get a variety of waves, and you can make it quite craggy. So in the sample video that I had used, I think they used a value of 20. You can get in that range. I want you to be happy with the bumpiness of your background. So in review, what we've done is we've added a base, and now what we're going to do is we're going to add a background. So that when we add a camera, the camera doesn't look off into blackness but has something else. We're going to use another plane. Now to create this plane, I want to do it in a front viewport rather than in a top viewport. So in looking at the front viewport here, I'm going to click to make sure it's the active viewport. I'm going to go back to the Create panel, and under my geometric primitives, I'm going to grab a plane, and I'm going to simply click and drag to put a background scene in. You could think of this like it's a billboard or something like that, but we want to make it really large. So as we reviewed before, I can make this length and width, let's do 5,000 and 5,000 again. 128 segments are fine. I can actually simplify this to a much smaller number, but for consistency I'll leave them. And what I wanted to start to talk about just briefly is, now that I've got a background with a color different than the foreground, I can think about placing a camera in the scene. And for placing a camera, I'm going to move myself over to this left viewport here. I've clicked to make it active, and while I've got plane 001, I need to give it a better name, such as backdrop. Now one thing about planes is they only have one side that shows a material. So if there's a color on one side, the other side's probably black. It's just how that works. So now that I've got it named and I'm sure I've got it selected, I'm going to lock my selection, which you can do by pressing on the space bar to lock your selection on the backdrop. And I'm going to use the Move tool to move this object. So I've got it locked so I don't accidentally move the snowman, and I'm going to move my background plane. And as I do so, you'll start to see that in the orthographic view I have above that you get some more distance between the snow person and the backdrop. Now the part we've been building up to, we're going to add a camera in the scene. As we've talked about, and by the way, if you look in the top viewport here, I've got a lot more space I could add, but I'm just going to stop here where this is good enough for the purposes of adding our camera. I'm on the Create panel, and we've talked about simple primitives here. We've also gone in here and created some text by using the second one over, known as splines. I'm going to skip over lights for now, and I'm going to go to cameras. There are a variety of camera types. For this purpose, we're going to use a target camera. Target camera is going to be very similar to a person standing still with a camera taking the same angle, always from that same particular area. The first click will create the camera, and then as you drag your mouse, you're setting a target, and that second click will be what the camera is focused on. So what I'm going to do is, in the left viewport, I'm going to click to create a target camera, which I have it highlighted. I'm not going to name it yet, but I might change the camera later. We'll talk about these other settings briefly in a minute. First click is going to be from the front face opposite of the backdrop. Click to create this camera, and now drag, and I want to get my target just past the actual snow person and let go. Now you'll notice two things popped in here, camera 001 and camera 001 target. They can be selected independently. Now while this is a front viewport in the lower right hand corner, I'm going to click on the word front, and you're going to see that there's a new option to go to camera 001, and I get a different position than just a standard front view. And this will get more interesting if I add more in the scene. Could be other elements like more snow people, a billboard with your logo in it. We'll touch base on that in a minute. Now we've added a camera, and I'm going to introduce another topic here called rendering. If I press the F9 key, it will render the scene. You'll notice the word Be Chill, which is the text that I added, along with the snow person, the bumpy meadow, and a backdrop. The rendition, or the render, looks different than a simple screenshot, and we'll be dealing with a rendition when we're dealing with our scenes that we're creating in 3ds Max for our portfolio. Next, let's talk about making this look a little bit more like snow by changing just the color. So if I click on the meadow itself and change the color to something that looks more like snow, you might start to wonder, what could you do with the background so it's not so plain? I'm going to introduce something called the material editor. This is different than what you need to get done on Wednesday, but we're going to play with it a lot on Thursday. To bring up the material editor, I'm going to touch M on the keyboard. This is going to bring up what we call a slate material editor, and I want to show you something that's called a physical material. Physically based materials, if I click and drag a marble out, it gives me a number of settings. And if I click on this node here, it's got pins. If I make sure I got it selected, I double clicked on it. These pins come in and these nodes come out. The thing that's special about a physical material is I can actually select something that's a pre-built, such as frosted glass. Now that I have this set up as frosted glass, I can click from the output node and put it on an object, and now this meadow will actually be as though it's made of frosted glass. You get an approximation of it in the viewport, but remember that render setting I mentioned before? The other way to do a render is to click on Render Frame Window right here, and when I click on Render, I'll now see that I've got a frosted glass, and you see the reflection of your snow person in the reflected glass. The rendition is taking that into account. So I can also add materials to my snow people as well. What I can do is, in the same slate material editor, bring out a separate physical material, double click to make sure it's selected, and I'm going to name this one Shiny Dude. And I'm going to use a preset here. I should have named the last one something different. And I'm going to use polished concrete as my starting point. So polished concrete, believe it or not, can look a little bit like snow. So I'm going to drag the output node here, and I can't put it on the rendition. I'm glad I did that because you can't drag it to the rendition. I need to go to the actual scene to assign that material. So the shiny concrete I'm going to put on the 3 spheres that I've been working with. I'm looking in my camera mode, so I can't scroll in. That's another good thing to show you. I want to get to his head. There we go. Make sure I get to head. There we go. Head. I see head. Smile. Smile. All right, I'm going to let go of it there. I'm going to change this from camera to perspective by touching on P, and then I can scroll in and use the middle mouse button to drag him down and apply this same material to his head. Now to get back to the camera view, I can touch C for camera, and I can render this out again, which is the F9 key to get a quick render. So now we're going to get a combination, oh, it's having problems with this, of my concrete along with the shininess. I don't like that. That really failed. We'll get into this in more detail on Thursday, as I said. Let's try brushed metal. There we go. And let's try to render that out. Now, without any lights, I'm not sure how shiny this is going to be. Oh, yeah, that's shiny. There's our Tin Man. And the last part we're going to talk about here before we move too far into it is to put an image on the background. Glazed ceramic. That sounds nice. Let's see if I can get to glazed ceramic. And I'll change my color so that it looks more like a white color. Again, all these parameters can be played with as you're working with them. And before I move on from here, I'm going to do an F9 for a quick render. There he is with shiny porcelain on some frosted glass. That looks pretty nice. So for the background, which we're getting a lot of environmental impact from, I want to make it more like a snow scene. Closing the render, and coming back in here, I want to actually find a standard material. So I had been grabbing physical material. I'm going to grab a standard material, and along with standard material, I want to zoom back a little bit so I can show you what's going on. I have something called an ambient color and a diffuse color. if I bring in a bitmap node, it'll ask me, bitmap, which bitmap? I'm going to go to the spot where I keep all of the things for this particular project. For example, in the Meadow is a design challenge. So if I go into the design challenge examples, in the Meadow we can build a snowman. You'll find I've got possible background images that if you view them as extra large icons, you could use any one of these, or you could find your own. I'm going to grab this Frosty Night wallpaper, click on Open, and I'm going to take this bitmap and put it into, it's going to get a little messy unless I move things around here. I'm going to drag the output pin from here into the ambient as well as the diffuse color. You'll see that that image starts to show up in the sample slot, and I can drag that into my scene. Now it doesn't look like much right now, but if I render it out again, there's the background scene. This is getting very close to what you're going to get turned in by Friday, but I did show you how to add a camera in the scene. This is the completion of the demo, and make sure you give me either an updated image or a private comment that you viewed the video and how excited you are on doing this when you get back into the session on Thursday. Remember, private comment or image every day this week, building up to Friday when you're going to have your finished snow person turned in. Thank you, students.